Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. I'm back again for another investigation into ray tracing on Nvidia's RTX cards, this time with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which has finally been updated to support both DirectX ray tracing shadows and Nvidia's DLSS upscaling technology. It's been several months since ray tracing was first shown off in this game, and a good 6 months since the game was released, but hey, the feature was added in eventually. The inclusion of ray tracing in Shadow of the Tomb Raider marks the implementation of the third and final ray tracing technique we currently have at our disposal. Battlefield 5 used ray traced reflections, Metro Exodus used ray traced global illumination, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider uses ray traced shadows. Hopefully in the future we'll see games use a combination of these techniques, but right now each game is choosing one of the three, and after today we should have a good idea at how each technique can improve visuals. Before we get to that though, this video is sponsored by Corsair and their new Dominator Platinum RGB memory. This new DDR4 memory packs tightly screened high-frequency memory chips, providing speeds of up to 4800 megatransfers per second, and while high frequencies, big capacities, and low latency timings are what the Dominator series is all about, this new Platinum RGB memory looks the part as well, with a dozen ultra-bright, individually addressable RGB LEDs encased in a high-quality aluminium heat spreader. Check them out via the link in the description below. Accessing ray tracing in Shadow of the Tomb Raider is pretty easy. There's no need for a driver update, all you need is the latest game patch, which isn't even that large. From there you can choose between 3 ray traced shadow modes when you launch the game: medium, high, and ultra. The game even gives you a decent description of what each mode does. With medium you get ray traced shadows for selected point lights, plus regular shadowing techniques for the rest of the game. With high, shadow maps start getting replaced in favor of more ray tracing from spot and directional lights, including the sun. And then with Ultra, you get more shadows and additional rays. DLSS has its own setting that can be activated as well. For the following tests and comparisons, we've set the game to use the maximum quality setting, so that's a level above the highest preset with everything enabled. After all, if you're using ray tracing, you're pretty much going to be after premium graphics, so you should already have all the things cranked up to the highest. All testing was done on my standard Core i9 9900K test rig, with game footage captured using the RTX 2080 Ti at 4K. But I also have performance data for all RTX GPUs at different resolutions as well, which I'll get to later. The first thing to note is that the medium ray tracing setting doesn't affect the quality of shadows in most situations because it only ray traces point light shadows. So this would be a light from a fire or lamp, for example. When outdoors, the medium mode uses standard ultra quality shadow maps because shadows from the sun are not ray traced here. This is why in a lot of these comparisons, there's no appreciable difference between DXR off and DXR on medium. Where you start to notice a difference is with the high and ultra modes. Depending on the area, the difference is quite huge, with ray trace shadows looking softer in general thanks to its more accurate distance-based shadowing. Ultra shadows in this game look pretty good, they are sharp across most elements, but ray tracing is an upgrade if accuracy is what you like. In this scene, for example, shadows cast from overhead foliage are soft due to the large distance between the foliage and the ground, while Lara's own shadow is much sharper as it's closer to the shadowed surface. While I like the ray trace shadow presentation and believe it looks more accurate, like with other ray trace techniques, the change might not be something everyone likes. As most games use sharper shadows, this distance-based system might be a bit jarring or look worse if you prefer that standard sharper shadow look. One thing is quite clear though, the high shadow mode is not good. In fact, it looks worse than the ultra non-ray trace shadow mode in my opinion due to a lack of shadow density. For some reason, the high mode just seems to remove a lot of shadows, particularly from overhead foliage, which is obviously not the intended presentation looking at both ultra regular shadows and ultra ray trace shadows. The ray count limitation here is too tight, and while the shadows that are cast look better and more accurate, removing shadows to get this effect I feel is not really a good compromise. Ray trace shadows have a number of other advantages. The game already appears to use distance-based shadowing for some dynamically generated shadows without ray tracing, but there's a fair bit of aliasing present even using the ultra mode. When switching ray tracing on, this aliasing disappears and you get a much cleaner presentation with better distance calculations. It's with these shadows, including Lara's own shadow, which suffers from the same issue, that ray tracing is the biggest upgrade. In many areas, ray tracing also delivers more depth to the scene with better and more accurate shadowing of objects such as handrails, rocks, tables, and so on. Again, without ray tracing, the scene still looks excellent, but ray tracing steps it up a notch. And then here we can see where point lights come into play, which is an effect you get with the medium mode enabled. Beside this fire, there are actually no shadows cast with ray tracing off, but when switching it to medium, Lara immediately casts an accurate shadow onto the wall behind her. There's not much to be gained from higher modes with point light shadows, and there are plenty of other point lights throughout the game that do cast shadows on, even with ray tracing off, but this was one of the best examples I could find. Yeah, the developers probably could have implemented regular shadows for this light, but even then it wouldn't look as good as ray tracing. While I have been talking a lot about the visual upgrades that ray tracing provides, there are also a decent amount of issues I noticed. Again, looking at the high ray tracing mode here, there is a serious shadow draw distance issue. When you roam around large environments, there is an obvious flat line transition between ray traced shadows and regular shadows that is extremely visible and quite jarring. It's another reason I wouldn't consider using the high mode at all. Not only are there fewer shadows in general, the transition line is just awful. This obvious transition point isn't a problem on the ultra ray tracing mode, but there is another issue at play here, and that's shadow pop-in. As you roam around, you can spot shadows magically appearing for some objects with no fade-in. They're just popping out of thin air in the distance. In contrast, with ray tracing disabled, there is still a limit to how far shadows are drawn, but there is a nice fade-in transition to these shadows as you move around rather than a jarring pop-in. I'd say shadow draw distance with the ultra mode is similar to off in general, but the off mode clearly handles the transition more gracefully. Then there are some instances where ray trace shadows don't work correctly. In this scene, the roofing on the left should be shadowing the wall with a pattern similar to the leafing on the roof. That's what you get with regular shadows, but with ray tracing it seems like the alpha texture is not being traced correctly, so what we get is a large outline of presumably where the geometry is. It doesn't look right and doesn't really make sense, although in other areas of the game this sort of alpha channel does seem to be handled properly. With that said, I did spot some other artifacting in the game with ray tracing, again on roofing. In this scene, the shadowing present on the rocks on the left is a lot better with ray tracing on, but ray tracing also introduces these weird patterns into the roof that don't really look quite right. Looking at the overall quality, my thoughts are here that ray trace shadows do look good in general, but only if you use the ultra mode. There are too many issues with the high mode, including reduced shadow density and a horrible transition point, that makes this mode look worse than ray tracing disabled. The ultra mode does have its issues, including weird artifacts and pop-in, but to me it looks better than ray tracing disabled and definitely more accurate. The medium mode is okay when there are point lights around, but the upgrade is basically non-existent in many outdoor environments. The good thing as well with this game is it's a slower paced game with an emphasis on stunning visuals, so there's more time to appreciate the improved shadow quality. And in most cases it's not just a subtle change, it's a decent upgrade that I'm sure most of you will have noticed in the comparisons so far. The major problem with ray trace shadows in Shadow of the Tomb Raider is, again, the performance though. The developers have clearly put in a lot of time to make sure the game doesn't run as poorly as the original demos, but the performance still isn't great. I'll start here with the RTX 2080 Ti results, with performance captured using the in-game benchmark tool, which is fairly representative of the scenes I've showed in this video. Across all three resolutions, the hit moving from off to ultra is pretty significant. At 1080p, performance drops by 39% on average, with an even larger 57% hit to 1% lows. Then at both 1440p and 4K, you're getting a 41% drop on average. When factoring in 1% lows, which show performance in the most intensive areas of the benchmark, it's typical to see your frame rate cut in half when using the ultra ray tracing mode, and that is usually what I found in general gameplay in intensive areas. At 4K, it was common to sit around 60 FPS with ray tracing off, while a touch under 30 FPS with ultra ray trace shadows. It's pretty painful. The medium mode doesn't see as much of a drop, a mere 14% at 4K on average, but it also doesn't provide much of a visual improvement outside of select scenes. And in fact, the performance hit is higher than 14% in these specific scenes where point lights come into play, with the benchmark tool going through a number of different areas. With that said, the drop isn't significant in outdoor areas with no point lights. You'll only see maybe 2 to 3 FPS shaved off, so the good news is you won't be punished when the effect isn't visible, like is sort of the case with Battlefield 5. There's also not much of a difference between the high and ultra modes, again usually about 2 to 3 FPS at most. As the high mode looks awful, there's no way I'd use it over the slightly more intensive ultra mode. With the RTX 2080, we're seeing similar margins, a 43% reduction in frame rate at 1080p, moving from off to ultra, 41% at 1440p, and 41% as well at 4K. The RTX 2080 is definitely not powerful enough for ray tracing at 4K, and it's only borderline at 1440p, dropping from an 80 FPS average to below 50 FPS. At this resolution, you'll want an adaptive sync monitor. For the RTX 2070, I only tested 2 resolutions because it's quite obvious this card, along with the RTX 2060, can't handle the game at 4K. Again, we're looking at around a 42% drop at 1440p and 41% at 1080p. The RTX 2070 is good for a 60 FPS experience at 1440p with ray tracing disabled, but enabling ray tracing sees 1% lows dip below 30 FPS, which isn't great. I'd say the card is probably just not quite powerful enough for 1440p with ray tracing, although as it delivers 60 FPS at 1080p, it is fine there. As for the RTX 2060, well, no surprises that it can't handle ray tracing at 1440p. It sees a 45% drop in frame rate, which takes a card that is fine at 1440p without being amazing, to a card that simply can't play the game at a reasonable frame rate. At 1080p though, it's a better situation. You will see that 41% drop in frame rate, but at around 50 FPS I'd still say the game is playable, so not a total disaster. I guess my main problem here with ray tracing in Shadow of the Tomb Raider is once again the performance. The visuals are good, so it's not like a Battlefield 5 situation where you get both awful performance and noisy ray traced effects, but we're still talking about having your frame rate significantly reduced when ray tracing is enabled. The performance hit is a lot higher than in Metro Exodus, although for a larger visual improvement as well. Considering the regular non-ray traced ultra shadows already look very good and the game in general looks amazing on maximum settings, I just don't think it's worth turning ray tracing on in most situations. Halving your frame rate is a huge hit to take. We're talking at least a 30 FPS reduction, which just isn't going to work for most people. The situations where I could see this hit being worthwhile are where you could have excess performance at your native resolution. So that's really with the RTX 2080 and RTX 2080 Ti at 1080p and the RTX 2080 Ti at 1440p. With those GPUs, you can run the game at over 100 FPS with ray tracing off, so turning it on only brings you down to around 50 FPS or so in those worst case environments. It's a big hit, but we're not in console performance territory. With other combinations, we're looking at performance near 30 FPS at times. Take the RTX 2070 for example. Would you rather play the game at 60 FPS at 1440p with ray tracing off, or 1080p at below 60 FPS with ray tracing on? To me, the higher resolution is a much bigger improvement in visual quality, especially at those resolutions, provided you have a capable monitor of course, so I wouldn't want to downgrade resolution to use ray tracing. Shadow of the Tomb Raider does have DLSS, but we've already shown this technology to be unnecessary at best in our examinations in other games. From what I've seen in Tomb Raider, DLSS is not as good as the implementation in Metro Exodus, but better than Battlefield 5. DLSS is definitely not as sharp as the native presentation, it's blurry in some areas and doesn't let the fine texture work in the game shine. I'd stick to experimenting with standard resolution scaling here, where you can achieve better performance and or better visuals. All up, it's hard to put into a succinct word how I feel about ray tracing in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. On the one hand, the visual upgrade is decent and the game can look good using the Ultra mode, and on the other hand, that comes at a huge performance cost. It's not outright mediocre like in Battlefield 5, I wouldn't say it's disappointing either, I wouldn't say it's fine or good because of the performance cost, it's maybe just a bit meh. Where this sort of technology will shine is when the performance hit can be reduced significantly. If the frame rate drop was maybe 15 to 20% rather than 40%, it would be easier to justify turning it on. For that, we'd need much more powerful ray tracing hardware, so more RT cores, faster acceleration, and just more power in general. Unfortunately, that's probably several generations down the line. Of all the ray traced implementations I've seen so far, I'd probably still lean towards Metro Exodus being the best balance of visual upgrades with performance cost, but we're still not in a situation with any of the RTX games so far where I could easily recommend using ray tracing or buying a card that can do it. It's far too early to think of this as a technology that's anything other than a cool tech demo that's, I guess, a bonus for owners of RTX graphics cards. That's it for this investigation into ray tracing in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on RTX in this game if you have played it, so chuck them down in the comments below. If you like these sorts of investigations, consider subscribing and supporting us on Patreon, and I'll catch you in the next one.